Welcome to the next installment of the Sunday Sit Down. I'm John McCabe. Today I'm in Pittsburgh meeting with Bridgeport native and world-renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Joseph Maroon to talk a little bit about the human brain, exercise, and living well. Dr. Maroon, thank you for taking some time from your busy schedule to talk with us today.
Very happy to, John. My pleasure.
Okay, it's August. As this airs, it'll be August, and that means it's football time in pretty much throughout the United States now. And the Steelers are just now back in camp. High Valley teams are getting ready to start practices, and colleges are back. As the team neurosurgeon for the Steelers, in a position you've had now for a couple decades plus, what concerns do you have with the well-being of the players, particularly after some time off this year? They haven't had as much time to train. But not only with professional, but when you get down into high school, college, and even down into the Pop Warner level as it pertains to concussions.
Well, the most important concern at this particular time with the heat wave we're having, of course, is that of appropriate hydration and conditioning. So hydration becomes extremely important because of the possibility of heat stroke, and also because when dehydrated and feeling weaker, there's less protective reflexes, particularly when it comes to contact. So the conditioning of the cervical muscles, the appropriate fitting of good equipment, particularly helmets, and then the basics, particularly at the high school level, of proper blocking and tackling techniques become critical. Once these are covered, then it becomes a matter of instituting those principles, blocking and tackling correctly, and not using the head as a battering ram, but using it appropriately in a head-up or side position when tackling and blocking.
The medical community has learned a lot over the last several decades as it pertains to concussions. Again, I'm sure your work with the Steelers and some of the things that you've been able to institute in helping to diagnose concussions and to also talk about, or also to show when players are ready to return. We'll get into that a little later. But it does seem as if you still have a lot of concussions, and the effects are maybe becoming a little more known as to what happens long term. I was just recently reading a study that was released about a possible link to concussions, and as you get older, dementia, maybe Alzheimer's, and also that maybe one out of every 5 athletes this year alone will suffer some type of concussion. What concerns do you have? Our society seems to be becoming more and more fixated with high-impact sports. Obviously, the NFL is at an all-time high. MMA is very popular. Are we doing enough to ensure brain safety? Is equipment where it needs to be, or the fundamentals basic?
Let's start with what a concussion is.
Okay.
A concussion is a transient or temporary disturbance of neurological function, usually associated with complete recovery. So a transient disturbance of neurological function can mean a ding where you see stars, you have a very brief blurred vision, ringing of your ears, headache, or it can be associated with loss of consciousness, briefly or for minutes or longer. So when we're talking about concussion, only 10% of the concussions are associated with loss of consciousness. Most people used to think you had a concussion only when you were knocked out. Not so. 90% of concussions are the transient disturbance of vision, a little forgetfulness, memory impairment, reaction time is diminished. So what's happened is we've become extremely more aware of these seemingly minor disturbances that we're learning are not necessarily always minor. In other words, if you go back to play before the symptoms have completely cleared, you're much more likely to have another concussion with less force, less impact, and a more prolonged episode of recovery. So what the NFL, what high schools, what colleges are focusing on now. Number one, identifying the concussion when it's occurred, which in the past, quite frankly, has been overlooked. And then number two, not returning these individuals before the brain has a complete opportunity to recover. So, to that end, what I have developed, along with Mark Lovell, my associate, who's a neuropsychologist here in Pittsburgh as well, we developed the IMPACT system. IMPACT means immediate post-athletic concussion testing. And it's a 20-minute neurocognitive test that you take at a PC. Athletes can take it in a computer lab. We can download and test 100 patients in 30 minutes if they have a computer. And in 20 to 30 minutes, we can get a baseline in terms of their ability to process information, their memory, their reaction time to 1/100th of a second, and their visual and verbal ability to handle constructs. So with that baseline, we then, when an athlete has a transient disturbance of neurological function, retest them and compare against the baseline. And the NFL now has mandated 3 things before you return to play. Number one, you must be completely asymptomatic. In other words, no headache, nausea, vomiting, fatigability, sleepiness, drowsiness. At rest. You must also be completely asymptomatic after aerobic activity with exercise, a gradually progressive exercise regimen. Then number 3, you have to return to your baseline testing with IMPACT. If those 3 criteria are met, you can return to play. The NFL has also reduced the number of practices with contact beginning tomorrow. So they're cutting down on the number of impacts to the head and then instituting the guidelines that I said. So this should not only trickle down, but it should be enforced by the NCAA at the high school level and also the Little League level. There are only 1,900 people in the NFL. There are 1.5 to 1.4 million kids at high school and the college level, and then close to 3 million at the Pop Warner League. So if we can get uniform adaptation of these criteria, we'll go a long way into reducing the problems of concussion.
But I'm trying to think of the right way to say this, is that you mentioned colleges, high schools. How big of a push needs to be made to get a uniform standard in the sports community for appropriate testing of head injuries? I mean, I can remember back to my football days. You take a shot to the head, you get your bell rung a little bit, coach is yelling at you to get back to practice.
Absolutely, and it was the same with me. I don't know how many concussions I had playing at St. John's in Bel Air, Indiana University, where I played. I was the smallest guy in the Big Ten the year I played.
What position did you play? So you went to Indiana on
I was tailback.
Okay.
And believe it or not, defensive safety. I was 6'6" and 220 when I played at IU. And this is what's happened. But, I mean, it was common. Mm-hmm. But I think it wasn't appropriate either for what we know now. The problem now is that with repeated concussions, repeated head injuries, before the brain has had a time to repair itself, there's a condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which is what was diagnosed in Mike Webster and Strelzik and Long and Waters and several other big-name athletes. So the question is, this is a syndrome that develops several years after play, according to those who have written about this. And an associate of mine, Dr. Russell Blaylock, and I'll send you the paper.
Okay.
It's going to be published in the next week or two in Surgical Neurology International. We have put forth what we call a unifying hypothesis that explains what happens in the brain in post-concussion syndrome. These are athletes who continue to have symptoms prolonged. PTSD, post-traumatic shock disorder, in the military, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We believe that what happens is that there are particular cells in the brain called microglia, and they're the brain's innate white blood cells, so to speak. They get activated with trauma, infections, toxins, and they secrete agents that are very inflammatory. And these inflammatory agents cause what we term neuroinflammation, or inflammation of the brain. And all of these entities are associated with inflammation of the brain. So we're suggesting that there are ways to attack inflammation with some natural compounds that might reduce the incidence and the consequences of these diseases.
You mentioned soldiers, and it seems that that's something that the military seems to be taking a much more serious approach to now with concussions or brain injuries from roadside bombs, or just anything that might happen in war. What are you finding with our military members and the effects that are happening? What's happening to them overseas right now?
There are about 300 concussions per month in soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. 300 per month. Many of these have long-term consequences. The military is every bit as involved, if not more so, than the NFL. And our hypothesis, or our belief, is that what's good for an NFL quarterback is good for a person on the front ranks in Iran and Iraq. In other words, the impact system is now being evaluated by the Army as a baseline test and subsequent follow-up.
So that would be something whenever you maybe were deployed overseas initially, you would get your baseline, and then if you suffered...
We have already baselined about 35,000 special forces soldiers, so that we have that baseline, and on a PC, even in the field, you could do another impact test, compare it to the original, and have a good idea about the individual's abilities.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about younger athletes, high school and below. Should parents be concerned about, when you hear this and you look at things that happen with Mike Webster and Justin Strelzik, after that granted happens over a period of time, but should parents be concerned with allowing younger children to play football, soccer, any other sport where they have the possibility of taking headshots?
I saw some statistics a few years back. If you look at the time that kids, particularly in high school, spend in automobiles, at the same time they would be on the practice fields of basketball, football, wrestling, the incidence of injury from being in car accidents would be significantly higher than participating in sports. And yet the lessons learned on the fields of friendly strife, if you would, are very substantial. So yes, there should be concern. They should be concerned that the right equipment is obtained. They should also be concerned that they have impact testing before they start. And then they should be concerned if a concussion occurs, that they're managed appropriately.
What is something, again, with football just now getting underway, and we'll move on here real quick, but if a kid comes home and as a parent, if you notice your high school son is just maybe a little off, and says maybe took a helmet-to-helmet shot, what should a parent wait to go right to the hospital?
No, it's not an emergency unless there's a deteriorating level of consciousness or a progressively increase in the severity of the headache. Then they should go to a hospital. If it's, I just don't feel right, I feel a little punky, and that persists, they should see their physician the next day.
Okay, and maybe just the last question with concussion and brain injury. And you kind of touched on this, but maybe just make it real quick again. And again, you work with the Steelers, and you get, I'm sure the players get the finest medical care, and where the NFL really has taken a hard look at concussions over the last few years, even to the point of levying fines to stop hard hits. Again, maybe just one more time, is enough being done, or what is the main difference you see between what's being done at the professional level and then down to the high school, college, and below levels? Is it just the testing?
I think the testing is the main thing, although it's now becoming much more used, much more prevalent. There's still schools around the country who I believe are not current with what has been recommended at the higher levels. And I think it's incumbent on the principals, on the trainers, on the coaches to make sure that they're in keeping with the most current guidelines for managing head injuries and concussions.
Okay, and then just one more question on the Steelers. A fun question. You've worked with some really interesting characters there over your career, some legendary coaches. What's maybe one of your couple favorite memories of being the team neurosurgeon for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
Well, probably the most poignant memory is with Coach Chuck Noll, and it's why we're sitting here today. Coach Noll asked me to be the team doctor in the early 80s, and in 1990 I told him that his starting quarterback, David Woodley, couldn't play against the Dallas Cowboys the following week, and he said, why? I said, because he's had a concussion, and the guidelines say he needs to stay out 3 weeks. And he said, well, who wrote the guidelines? I said, well, the committee of doctors, and I happen to be one of them. What criteria did you use? Well, this and that. What data did you have that substantiated those criteria? And he said, look, Maroon, he looks good to me. He can throw, catch, he knows his plays. He's not having any symptoms. If you want me to keep a player out of football, I want objective data from you, not your impression or guidelines. And that's when I called Mark Lovell, the neuropsychologist, and I said, Mark, as chagrined as I am, he's right. And Mark is brilliant. He's a neuropsychologist, and he and I got together, and he put together the first impact test. I went back to Coach Noll. Coach, if you want data, then I have to have a baseline on the whole team. And he thought about it. He said, okay. So in 1990 was the first time we instituted in the NFL baseline testing for concussions. We subsequently made it computerized and on and on. We now have over 1.8 million kids that we've baselined, which is quite a number. And we're just partnering this week with Dick's Sporting Goods Store across the country. Dick's is going to donate over $1 million to test kids throughout the country under a joint program with Dick's and Impact.
So maybe go on to your passion, exercise.
Yeah.
I'll read through this real quick. You've completed 70 triathlons, 7 of them Ironmans, which involves a 2.4 mile swim, 112 miles of cycling, and 26.2 mile run. So it makes it pretty clear that you've made physical activity a priority in your life. With your medical practice, the time you spend with the Steelers and everything else, where do you find time to prepare yourself for such a grueling event?
I've learned, John, that in order to do what I do in surgery is the kind of surgery I do is kind of an endurance sport in a way, in the sense that you have to be totally focused, concentrating at all times, and your hand-eye coordination has to be very perfect to do what I do. And I've tried it both ways, in the sense that at one point in my life I was deconditioned, not working out, and I wasn't functioning at the highest level I could. And I learned that if I spend an hour a day in some kind of physical fitness program, that my mind, my body, everything works at a much higher level. So by staying in condition, it's not an option. For me, it's a necessity. I have to do that in order to function at the level that I want to function at.
Okay, well, why triathlons? That's kind of going to the extreme.
Yeah. Well, I'm also a very goal-directed individual, and for some reason, I can't force myself to work out unless I have a goal, and that goal is usually a race. And it challenges me to push. There's a saying, you never know what your limits are until you try to exceed them. And it's one of the things that I do enjoy when you think you can only go so far and then you go beyond that. It's very gratifying and uplifting.
Okay. Well, they're staying with exercise. Read where, again, as you mentioned, there was a time when, I mean, you weren't in the shape you wanted to be, and in fact, maybe even you returned home, had some things going on in your personal life, home to the Ohio Valley. What role did exercise have in helping you turn your life around? I believe that was in the early 80s.
Aerobic exercise is the very best antidepressant that anyone can ever use or ask for. I had a period in my life when I had some major family problems, and I became pathologically depressed. And I found that antidepressants, various pharmacologic agents were totally ineffective. And one day, Don Jebbia, who's a fellow at West Banco, I think, said, "Hey, let's go for a run." And I said, "I haven't run for 5 years. I don't think I can make it around the track." But I did, Triadelphia track. And I remember it very vividly. I made it around 4 times, and I was 20 pounds overweight, sluggish, totally out of it. And that night was the first night I slept in 3 months. So I went back the next day and did 1.25 miles and 1.5 miles. And pretty soon I started feeling better, sleeping better, eating better. My body wanted better fuel. And I increased my running and started to get sore knees, and read about triathlons and cross training. Got a bike, started riding, and then was intrigued at that time. That was early on. That was in the early 80s. I watched the Hawaiian Ironman Triathlon, which is something I never dreamt I would ever be able to accomplish. I couldn't even do a 10K race until I did a 10K race. And then I did a little mini triathlon, and then and 5 years later I was able to compete in the Hawaiian Ironman. But it's incremental.
Oh, sure. What's your favorite part of a triathlon? What's your best of the 3 disciplines?
Getting an IV in the medical tent. No, I like the bike the best. The run is sheer pain. After swimming 2.4 miles and biking 112 in 90 to 95 degree heat and crosswinds, you get off the bike and you say, "Now I have to do a marathon." and it just then you just got to reach way down.
Where would you place exercise in the pyramid of overall well-being in a person's life?
It's absolutely a daily point that must be touched. It's like food, exercise, avoiding environmental toxins, and reducing stress. Exercise helps your diet, it helps your stress reduction, and it's nothing but a positive.
Okay, let's move on to staying with exercise, but more of the health and longevity. You've written a book, it's called The Longevity Factor, How Resveratrol and Red Wine Activate Genes for a Longer and Healthier Life. First off, what is resveratrol?
Resveratrol is a natural antioxidant that's found generally in red wine, and it was found by a scientist, David Sinclair, who was head of the anti-aging lab at Harvard University, to activate particular genes involved with survival and energy metabolism. So that when we were on the savannah in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, we lived in a period of famine and feast. Correction. Yes, famine and feast and famine. Our bodies are conditioned to ingest as many calories as we can when they're freely available. That is what's contributed to the 60% obesity and overweight condition of the people in the United States. The problem is we don't have famines, because when we would have a famine, we would burn up the fat that we saved, and when we really got low on fuel, we would activate these particular genes called the sirtuin genes that are now called survival genes. So fasting is a very good thing, and we found that resveratrol can activate these same genes without fasting. So in a way, you can have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, because dark chocolate's one of the
It's right.
one of the ones you can eat, huh?
Is what several writers have said.
Fish oil is another item that you, or another substance that you advocate. Omega-3s.
Yes.
I'm sure you eat a lot of fish yourself, I believe, right?
Yes.
What, given that, what is your take on the diet most Americans eat today?
Well, I mean, it shows in what's happening. As I mentioned, 60% of the people are overweight or obese. It's atrocious. And the fast food stuff that we consume, the excessive sugar, and the carbonated drinks with phosphoric acid that leaches calcium out of our bones. It's just a very unhealthy diet for most people. You go to a checkout line at Giant Eagle or one of the big stores and you see what people have in their basket. But it's easy for me to get on a high horse and condemn. The problem, there's so many problems here that we could discuss, but when somebody has limited income, as many people in this country do, they're making choices for more amounts of food.
Sure.
And the potato chips and the pretzels and the soft drinks.
It's a lot cheaper than salmon.
It's a lot cheaper than organic vegetables and tomatoes
Exactly.
and good grades of meat. So it's a complicated socioeconomic problem.
Okay, and maybe just to wrap up here, we're just about out of time. Again, you come from the Ohio Valley, grew up in Bridgeport, born in Wheeling, went to St. John in Belair. When you look back at what of your success do you attribute to what you learned growing up in the Ohio Valley?
That's a very good question. I've really not thought about that. I would say 90% of it. And I'd say, if not 100. And General MacArthur had a great saying, and he had it inscribed over the doorway of the gymnasium of West Point. You remember what it is? As you come out of the gymnasium, and I've done this, and you look at the fields, the playing fields, the soccer fields, the football fields, the tennis courts. And the saying is, on the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds that on other days and on other fields will lead to victory. So when you ask me that question, the first thing that comes to my mind are the football fields in Bel Air, Donkey Field, which was nothing but gravel and dirt and rocks, where I learned you don't quit, you persevere no matter what the odds are. You maintain your integrity and honesty in play, and you remain loyal to your teammates and the people you work with.
Okay, well, Dr. Maroon, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.